Hello everyone. Welcome to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, and I also know that this might be your first time coming across our channel. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll explore a case that unfolded in the quiet community of Georgetown, South Carolina. This is a story about family, loyalty, and the dark places jealousy can lead us. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative guide you toward rest as we piece together what happened to Leon Harrison Jr. on a cold February night in 2017. The Spanish moss hangs heavy along the Black River in Georgetown County, South Carolina, where the water moves slowly through the low country landscape. It's a place where everyone knows their neighbors, where generations of families have lived side by side. But in March of 2017, this peaceful community would be shaken by a discovery that would reveal how family bonds can sometimes become chains that bind people to terrible secrets. Leon Harrison Jr., known to his friends and family as JR, was 32 years old in the winter of 2017. He had grown up in Georgetown, the son of Leon Harrison Sr., and had been especially close to his mother before her passing. Her death had been a tremendous blow to him, one that left a permanent mark on his heart. To honor her memory, he'd gotten a tattoo on his arm, a tribute that would later become crucial in a way no one could have imagined. Leon was a father to 2 young children from a previous relationship. Though that romance hadn't worked out, he'd remained on good terms with his former partner, maintaining his role in his children's lives. He was a working man, part of a construction crew building new bridges on Highway 701 near Johanna. It was honest work, the kind that required early mornings and steady hands, and Leon took pride in contributing to something that would serve his community for years to come. In 2013, Leon had met a woman named Tish Rue. Their courtship had been swift, and within a year they were married. Leon moved into the home on High Market Street that Tish shared with her father, Alexander Rue Sr., and her brother Alexander Rue Jr. It was a multi-generational household, the kind common in southern communities where family stays close. But as with many marriages, the early passion eventually gave way to complications. Tish began to suspect that Leon was seeing someone else. The trust between them eroded, conversations became arguments, and eventually they agreed to separate while trying to work things out. They settled on what they called an open marriage, an arrangement that allowed Leon to see other people, though the boundaries of this arrangement would prove to be less clear than they seemed. Leon had indeed found someone else. Her name was Rosario, and by early 2017 their relationship had grown serious. On February 25th, Rosario spent the day with Leon, the two of them enjoying each other's company the way new couples do, with that easy comfort that comes when you've found someone who makes you laugh. As evening approached, Rosario drove Leon to his father's house. She said goodbye, expecting to hear from him later that night, as was their routine. But around 10 o'clock that evening, Rosario's phone rang. It wasn't Leon, it was Tish. The conversation that followed was anything but civil. According to what Rosario would later tell police, Tish was ranting, her words sharp with anger. The message was clear and cutting. Tish wanted Leon back, or more precisely, she wanted to ensure that no one else could have him. The threats were thinly veiled beneath jealous rage. After the call ended, Rosario tried to reach Leon, but he didn't answer. What Rosario didn't know was that Leon had decided to return to the house on High Market Street that night. His cell phone records would later show that he arrived at the home around 10 o'clock in the evening. What happened next would remain partially obscured by the walls of that house, but the evidence would tell a story of violence and betrayal. Leon's last text message to Rosario came that night. The words were out of character, cold and final, stating he didn't love her and couldn't be with her anymore. Later, forensic analysts would examine the texting patterns, the way the words were structured, the phrasing and rhythm. Their conclusion would suggest that Leon hadn't been the one typing those words at all. 12 days passed. 12 days during which Leon Harrison Jr. simply vanished from the lives of everyone who knew him. His phone went silent. He didn't show up for work on the bridge construction crew. His father, Leon Sr., grew increasingly worried. So did Leon's former partner, the mother of his children. Both of them knew this wasn't like him. On March 9, 2017, they filed a missing person report with the Georgetown Police Department. Officers began the routine investigation that accompanies such reports, interviewing family members and friends, trying to piece together Leon's last known movements. They were surprised to learn that Leon's wife, Tish, hadn't reported him missing herself. When they asked her about this, she explained that they had an open marriage, that Leon sometimes stayed elsewhere, that this wasn't unusual. But just 2 days later, on March 11th, the case would transform from a missing person investigation into something far more sinister. A homeowner living along the Black River looked out across the dark water that morning and saw something floating near the shore. At first it was difficult to make out what it was. The water was murky, the object partially submerged. But as they looked closer, a terrible realization set in. They were looking at a human body. The Georgetown Police Department received the call around 12:15 in the afternoon. Officers and investigators rushed to the scene near Colonel Cole Drive, east of Brown's Ferry Landing. When they pulled the body from the water, they found it in a state of advanced decomposition. The victim had been in the river for some time. The features were unrecognizable, the body bloated and damaged by its time in the water. But there was something else that immediately caught the investigators' attention. The body was tightly bound. Multiple loops of speaker wire wrapped around the wrists and ankles, securing the limbs with deliberate precision. This was no accident, no drowning. Someone had made sure this person couldn't swim, couldn't struggle, couldn't save themselves. Due to the condition of the body, the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. The decomposition was too advanced, but there was one detail that allowed them to identify the victim. On the arm, still visible despite everything, was a tattoo, a memorial tattoo, a tribute to a beloved mother who had passed away. The investigators cross-referenced this with the missing person report filed just days before, and their worst fears were confirmed. The body in the Black River was Leon Harrison Jr. Detective Alan Morris found himself working his first homicide case. The young investigator knew that the first 48 hours were crucial, but those hours had long since passed. Leon had been dead for at least 2 weeks. Still, Morris and his team at the Georgetown Police Department, assisted by the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, began the meticulous work of building a case. They started with the fundamentals. Where was Leon last seen? Who did he know? What was happening in his life? The answers led them repeatedly back to the house on High Market Street, to Tashru, to her family. The investigators learned about the troubled marriage, about the open relationship, about Rosario. They learned about the angry phone call on the night of February 25th. They learned that according to Tish, she and Leon had argued that night, and he had left. But Leon's phone data told a different story. His GPS showed he had arrived at the High Market Street house at 10 o'clock that evening. His phone never left that location. Detective Morris and his team requested permission to search the house. What they found there would prove crucial to solving the case. In the bedroom that Leon and Tish sometimes shared, investigators noticed something immediately suspicious. Two sections of carpet had been cut away from the floor, not just lifted or pulled up, but deliberately cut out and removed. This wasn't the action of someone doing home renovation. This was the action of someone trying to hide something. The investigators examined the exposed carpet padding and the subfloor beneath where the carpet had been. Even to the naked eye they could see staining. When forensic testing was performed, the results confirmed what they suspected: blood. A significant amount of blood. The staining had soaked through the padding and penetrated into the wooden subfloor beneath. DNA analysis would later confirm that the blood belonged to Leon Harrison Jr. The amount of blood told its own story. As Detective Morris would later observe, given the quantity of blood in that room, it was difficult to imagine anyone walking away from whatever had happened there. This wasn't a minor injury. This was a violent event, one that had likely proved fatal, or close to it. But finding blood in the bedroom was only part of the puzzle. The investigators needed to know what happened after. How did Leon's body end up in the Black River, wrapped in speaker wire, left to drift in the dark water? The answer to that question would require looking more closely at the Rue family. In any investigation, physical evidence tells part of the story, but technology often fills in the crucial gaps. In this case, surveillance footage and cell phone records would prove invaluable. Investigators pulled security camera footage from the Walmart in Georgetown. What they found was both mundane and damning. At 1 o'clock in the morning on February 26th, just hours after Leon had arrived at the High Market Street house, two men appeared on the surveillance video. Alexander Rue Sr. and Alexander Rue Jr., Tisha's father and brother. They were purchasing 2 bottles of hydrogen peroxide. On its own, buying hydrogen peroxide isn't suspicious. It's a common household item. But in the context of everything else, it took on a darker meaning. Hydrogen peroxide is well known for its ability to break down blood, to remove bloodstains, to eliminate evidence. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Then there were the cell phone records. Investigators used a relatively new technology called Google geofencing, which allowed them to track the location of cell phones based on their interaction with cell towers and GPS data. What they discovered was striking in its coordination. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, on February 26, all 3 members of the Rue family, Tish, her brother Alexander Jr., and her father Alexander Sr., turned off their cell phones simultaneously. For several hours all 3 phones went dark. No calls, no texts, no data. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist in the digital world. When cell phones are turned off during a specific window of time, especially by multiple people in the same family, it raises an obvious question. What were they doing that they didn't want tracked? What location did they visit that they didn't want recorded? The evidence was circumstantial but building. Blood in the bedroom. Hydrogen peroxide purchased in the middle of the night. Phones turned off in coordinated fashion. A body in the river. The investigators felt they were getting close, but they needed more. They needed someone to break the silence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A friend of Alexander Rue Jr., a man named Antoine, came forward with information. He told investigators about a recent conversation he'd had with Alexander. They'd been spending time together when Alexander had started talking, almost boasting, about what had happened. According to Antoine, Alexander Jr. had said he'd been laying low. He'd talked about JR, about taking him out, about taking him for a ride. The implications were clear, even if the exact details were vague. Alexander Jr. had admitted to being involved in Leon's death, and according to what he told Antoine, his sister Tish knew about it. His father knew about it. They all knew. This statement from Antoine gave investigators the probable cause they needed. On March 31st, 2017, Alexander Roux Sr. was arrested and charged with accessory after the fact to murder and obstruction of justice. A week later, on April 6th, Taish Roux was arrested on similar charges. Alexander Roux Jr. initially remained at large, his whereabouts unknown, but he was eventually apprehended and booked into the Georgetown County Detention Center on April 9th. As the investigation continued and more evidence came to light, the charges against Taish and Alexander Jr. were upgraded to murder. The prosecutors believed they had enough to prove that these two hadn't just helped cover up a crime. They had committed it. The case that emerged painted a picture of a crime driven by jealousy and enabled by family loyalty. According to the prosecution, Taish had grown increasingly angry about Leon's relationship with Rosario. She didn't want him back out of love. She wanted him back because she couldn't stand the thought of him being with someone else. It was about control, about possession. On the night of February 25th, when Leon returned to the house, an argument had erupted, but this argument had escalated beyond words. At some point, violence had erupted in that bedroom. Whether it was planned or spontaneous, whether all three family members were involved from the beginning, or whether some were brought in afterward to help cover up what had happened, the exact sequence remained unclear, but the result was undeniable. Leon Harrison Jr. had been killed in that house, likely in that bedroom. His body had been wrapped in speaker wire, binding his arms and legs so that he couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't swim. Then his body had been transported to the Black River and dumped into the dark water, left to sink or float, to be found or lost forever. The wheels of justice turned slowly. It would be more than 4 years before the case went to trial. On October 11th, 2021, Alexander Roux Sr., Alexander Roux Jr., and Taish Roux stood together in a Georgetown County courtroom. The trial lasted 8 days. Prosecutors presented hours of video interviews, forensic testimony about the blood evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. The jury heard from Detective Morris about the investigation. They heard about the cut carpet, the blood that had soaked into the floor. They heard about the hydrogen peroxide purchased in the middle of the night. They heard about the cell phones all going dark at the same time. They heard Antoine describe what Alexander Jr. had told him. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They emphasized the lack of a definitive cause of death. They questioned whether prosecutors could prove exactly what had happened in that bedroom. They suggested that the open marriage arrangement complicated the narrative, that perhaps Leon had enemies the police hadn't considered. But the prosecution had a theme that resonated throughout the trial. Blood is thicker than water. The Roux family had closed ranks. They had lied to police. They had attempted to conceal evidence. They had turned off their phones and purchased cleaning supplies in the middle of the night. If they were innocent, why had they acted so guilty? After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours. When they returned, they had reached verdicts on all counts. Alexander Roux Sr. was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of obstruction of justice. The jury believed he had helped cover up the crime, but hadn't been directly involved in killing Leon. Alexander Roux Jr. was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice. Taish Roux was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice. At sentencing, Taish and Alexander Jr. each received 37 years in prison for the murder conviction and an additional 8 years for obstruction of justice, with the sentences to run concurrently. Alexander Sr. received 8 years for obstruction of justice, suspended to the time he had already served, 549 days, followed by 3 years of probation. In the courtroom that day when the verdicts were read, Leon Harrison Jr.'s family finally had answers. More than a dozen family members had attended the trial, sitting through every session, listening to every piece of evidence. Among them was Reese Moultrie, Leon's first cousin, who had been raised with him like siblings in their close-knit family. She later recalled that Leon had been working on the bridge construction crew at Highway 701 when he died, building something that would serve the community for decades. She remembered him as someone who had been close to everyone in the family, someone whose absence left a hole that could never be filled. When the guilty verdicts were announced, Leon's father, Leon Harrison Sr., smiled for the first time since his son's death. After years of waiting, of wondering, of living with the loss and the uncertainty, he finally had justice. He could finally sleep. The case revealed the dark side of family loyalty, the way bonds that should protect and support can be twisted into something ugly. The prosecution had argued that Tish had put the murder in motion, and her family had stepped up to help her. They had covered for her, lied for her, helped dispose of evidence and obstruct the investigation. They had believed that if they stayed together, if they kept their stories straight, they could get away with it. But the evidence had been too strong. The blood in the bedroom, the suspicious purchases, the coordinated silencing of cell phones, the witness statement from Alexander Jr.'s friend, all of it had come together to paint a clear picture of what happened. As we come to the end of this story, let your mind settle on the quieter details. The Spanish moss along the Black River, the sound of construction crews building bridges that will outlast all of us, the ordinary moments that make up a life, the text messages and phone calls, the arguments that sometimes escalate beyond what anyone intended. Leon Harrison Jr. was 32 years old when he died. He was a father, a son, a cousin raised like a brother. He was a construction worker building bridges. He had loved his mother deeply and carried her memory with him always. That tattoo on his arm, meant to honor her, became the key to identifying him after death, bringing him home one final time. The Lass River continues to flow through Georgetown County, dark and slow, carrying its secrets. The bridges Leon helped build still stand on Highway 701, traveled by thousands of people who will never know his name. His children are growing up without him. His father learned to smile again, but the grief remains. Tish Rue and Alexander Rue Jr. remain in prison, serving their sentences. Alexander Rue Sr. served his time and was released to probation. The house on Highmarket Street still stands, though perhaps no one who lives there now knows what happened in that bedroom in February of 2017. Justice was served, but justice doesn't bring anyone back. It doesn't undo what was done. It simply acknowledges the truth and holds people accountable for their actions. And now, as this story comes to a close, let yourself drift. Let the details fade. Let sleep find you gently, knowing that even in the darkest stories, the truth eventually surfaces, just like a body in a river, carried by the current, until someone finally looks close enough to see what's really there. So if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. We'll journey together through a story that speaks to the complexity of human emotions, the fragility of life, and the devastating consequences when jealousy goes unchecked. Tonight we travel to the late summer of 2022, to the quiet suburbs of Beaufort, Georgia, where a young mother's dreams of a better life would end in unimaginable tragedy. Ashley Bocanegra was born on November 18, 1991, in the vibrant streets of the Bronx, New York. She grew up surrounded by the energy and diversity of the city, a place where resilience was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Ashley embodied that resilience. Her family and friends described her as someone who lit up every room she entered, a woman whose smile was infectious and whose dedication to those she loved was unwavering. By her late 20s, Ashley had become a mother to a beautiful son, a boy who became the center of her universe. His father, Julian Reyes, remained an important part of their lives, and though Ashley and Julian's romantic relationship had faded, they maintained a strong co-parenting bond. They shared an apartment in Beaufort, each focused on giving their 7-year-old son the stability and love he deserved. But Ashley had bigger dreams. She wanted more than what New York could offer. She wanted space, opportunity, a place where her son could grow up with fresh air and new possibilities. So in 2022, Ashley made the brave decision to relocate from the Bronx to Beaufort, Georgia, a suburb northeast of Atlanta known for its family-friendly atmosphere and growing job market. Georgia represented hope. It represented a second chance. Ashley found work as a manager at Floor & Decor, a home improvement retailer where she quickly proved herself capable and dedicated. She was ambitious, organized, and well-liked by her colleagues. Her days were filled with managing inventory, leading her team, and ensuring customers found exactly what they needed to create beautiful spaces in their homes. Life seemed to be falling into place. Her son was adjusting well to their new home. She had a stable job with room for growth. She and Julian maintained a respectful, functional partnership as they raised their child together. Ashley had every reason to believe that the worst was behind her and that brighter days lay ahead. But as is so often the case in life, happiness can be fragile, and sometimes, the choices we make in pursuit of connection can lead us down paths we never imagined. At Floor & Decor, Ashley's life intersected with that of Daniel Gonzalez. Daniel was younger, charming, and attentive. He worked under Ashley's supervision, and over time, what began as friendly workplace conversation evolved into something deeper. There was laughter during lunch breaks, lingering glances across the showroom floor, text messages that extended beyond work hours. For Ashley, Daniel represented something she hadn't felt in a while: excitement, attraction, the intoxicating feeling of being wanted. She knew the situation was complicated. She knew Daniel had a life outside of work, commitments she didn't fully understand. But human hearts rarely operate on logic alone. Despite the warning signs, despite the voice in her head that urged caution, Ashley allowed herself to fall for Daniel. What Ashley didn't fully grasp was the extent of Daniel's entanglements. Daniel Gonzalez was engaged to 27-year-old Antonetta Stevens, a relationship that spanned 5 years. Together they shared a home in the Preston Hills at Mill Creek Apartments in Beaufort. They had built a family together, raising Antonetta's 9-year-old son from a previous relationship and their own 3-year-old child. Daniel's 17-year-old sister, Janine Gonzalez, also lived with them, having moved down from Buffalo, New York. From the outside, Daniel and Antonetta's life appeared stable, if not perfect. But beneath the surface, cracks had formed. Daniel felt trapped, suffocated by the demands of domestic life. He was drawn to Ashley's independence, her ambition, the way she made him feel like more than just a partner and provider. So Daniel did what many people do when they're unhappy, but lack the courage to confront their situation honestly. He lived a double life. He told Antonetta he couldn't take lunch breaks at work. He claimed his phone was dying when texts went unanswered. He crafted excuses for why he came home late, for why he seemed distant, and for a time his deceptions worked. But secrets, especially those involving matters of the heart, rarely stay buried forever. Daniel's 17-year-old sister, Janine, had always been observant. Living in her brother's home, she noticed the small changes in his behavior, the way his attention seemed elsewhere, the secretive phone calls. Eventually, Daniel confided in Janine about his feelings for Ashley. Perhaps he needed to tell someone. Perhaps he hoped his sister would understand, would keep his confidence. Instead, Janine made a choice that would set catastrophic events into motion. She told Antonetta about the affair. For Antonetta Stevens, the revelation was devastating. She had given 5 years of her life to Daniel. She had borne his child, opened her home to his sister, built what she thought was a future together, to learn that he had been unfaithful, that he had been seeing another woman, someone he worked with every single day, felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. But Antonetta's pain quickly curdled into something darker, rage. And that rage found a target, not in Daniel, the man who had deceived her, but in Ashley, the woman she saw as an intruder, a threat, someone who had stolen what was rightfully hers. The day before the attack, Janine and Antonetta decided to confront the situation directly. They knew where Ashley worked. They knew Daniel's schedule. They drove to the Floor and Decker location and positioned themselves near a quick-trip convenience store situated nearby. And there, just as they suspected, they saw Daniel and Ashley walking together during his lunch break. The very lunch break Daniel had told Antonetta he couldn't take that day. Antonetta's worst fears were confirmed. She approached them, and an argument erupted right there in public. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. Ashley, likely shocked and embarrassed, tried to de-escalate. Daniel stood caught between the two women, his carefully constructed lies collapsing in real time. Eventually, the confrontation ended. Antonetta and Janine returned home. Ashley went back to work, shaken but perhaps believing the worst had passed. She couldn't have known that in Antonetta's mind, this was only the beginning. On Thursday, August 11th, 2022, Daniel Gonzalez was asleep in the apartment he shared with Antonetta. It was late morning, and the Georgia heat had already begun to build. While he slept, Antonetta made her move. She took Daniel's phone and began scrolling through his messages with Ashley. There it was, all the evidence she needed, the flirtation, the planning, the intimacy that confirmed her suspicions. But Antonetta didn't wake Daniel to confront him. Instead, she saw an opportunity. Sitting down with Janine, the two women formulated a plan. Antonetta would use Daniel's phone to send messages to Ashley, pretending to be Daniel himself. She crafted a story designed to pull at Ashley's sympathies and to lure her to the apartment. The messages claimed that Daniel was being kicked out of his home because of the affair, that he needed Ashley's support, that he wanted to see her. Ashley, reading these messages, had no reason to suspect they weren't from Daniel. The texts came from his number. The situation, while dramatic, wasn't implausible given what had happened the previous day. So Ashley made the decision to go to the Preston Hills at Mill Creek Apartments. Perhaps she wanted to help Daniel. Perhaps she wanted to talk things through. Perhaps she simply wanted to see him. Whatever her reasons, Ashley got into her car shortly before 11 o'clock in the morning and drove to the address. She parked and made her way toward the apartment, expecting to find Daniel, expecting to have a conversation, expecting many things. But she did not expect what actually awaited her. The moment Ashley arrived at the apartment complex, Antonetta and Janine were ready. There would be no conversation. There would be no chance for Ashley to explain or defend herself. This was an ambush. Janine pulled out her phone and began recording. What happened next was captured on video, a brutal assault that would later become key evidence in a murder case. Antonetta approached Ashley with fury in her eyes. She grabbed Ashley by her hair and yanked her to the ground. The attack was immediate and vicious. Antonetta struck Ashley repeatedly, landing blows to her face, her chest, Ashley tried to protect herself, tried to fight back, but she was overpowered. Throughout the assault, Antonetta screamed threats. Her voice, captured on Janine's video, repeated chilling phrases, "I will murder you," and "Are you ready to die?" The words hung in the air between the sounds of impact, between Ashley's cries for help. Janine wasn't merely a passive observer. She joined in the attack, dragging Ashley by her hair along the pavement, kicking her multiple times in the chest and back. The concrete scraped Ashley's skin. The kicks landed with terrible force, and all the while, Janine continued filming, even laughing at moments, treating the brutal violence as entertainment. The attack continued for what must have felt like an eternity to Ashley. Her ribs fractured under the pressure of the kicks. Her liver sustained severe damage from the blunt force trauma. She struggled to breathe, gasping for air as her body went into shock. Finally, mercifully, the assault stopped. Antonetta and Janine, apparently satisfied or perhaps simply exhausted, returned to their apartment. But they took something with them, Ashley's cell phone. Ashley lay there on the ground, battered and broken. Her face was swollen. Her body screamed in pain. She could barely draw breath into her lungs. But somehow, through sheer determination and perhaps not fully understanding how gravely she'd been injured, Ashley managed to stand. She stumbled after her attackers to the apartment door. She needed her phone. She needed to call for help. She knocked on the door, her voice weak, asking for her phone back. Inside, Daniel had woken to the commotion. He came to the door and saw Ashley standing there, her appearance shocking. Her face was battered, blood stained her clothes. She was hunched over, clearly in severe distress. For a moment, Daniel simply stared, perhaps unable to process what he was seeing, perhaps overwhelmed by guilt. He closed the door, but Ashley kept knocking. She needed that phone. Finally, Daniel opened the door again and handed her the cell phone. Ashley took it and turned away, limping back toward her car. What Ashley didn't realize in that moment was that her injuries were catastrophic. The human body can sometimes function on adrenaline even when it's failing internally. Ashley believed she could make it home. She got into her car and drove, each breath becoming more difficult, each movement sending waves of pain through her torso. Surveillance video from her apartment complex later captured Ashley's return. She staggered as she walked, groaning audibly, one hand pressed to her side. She made her way inside and immediately called Julian, her son's father and her co-parent. When Julian arrived home, he found Ashley in severe distress. She was leaning over the second-story railing of their apartment, desperately trying to catch her breath. Her face had turned pale. She could barely speak. Julian knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. He rushed her to the nearest hospital, Memorial Hospital, where the staff quickly assessed her condition. The fractured ribs had caused internal bleeding. Her liver, damaged by the brutal kicks, was failing. She couldn't breathe properly because her lungs were filling with fluid. The doctors made the decision to airlift Ashley to a larger medical facility with more advanced trauma capabilities. But time was running out. Ashley's body, pushed beyond its limits, was shutting down. Despite the medical team's best efforts, Ashley Bocanegra died before she could reach the operating room. She was 30 years old. Her 7-year-old son would grow up without his mother. Her family would have to bury a daughter, a sister, a beloved relative whose only crime had been falling for the wrong man at the wrong time. The time of death was recorded as early afternoon on August 11, 2022. What had begun as an ordinary Thursday morning had ended in unspeakable tragedy. While Ashley fought for her life at the hospital, police were already investigating. A nurse treating Ashley had contacted authorities to report that her patient had been assaulted around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, approximately 2 hours after the attack. investigators responded to the Preston Hills at Mill Creek Apartments. They found Antonetta Stevens and Janine Gonzalez at the apartment. The two women immediately attempted to control the narrative. They claimed that Ashley had shown up at their door uninvited, that she had been the aggressor, that the fight had been mutual, that they had simply defended themselves. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in their story. They also discovered that Daniel Gonzalez was present in the apartment and had scratches and injuries on his shoulders and back. When asked how he'd gotten those injuries, Daniel refused to explain. As the investigation continued, detectives began piecing together what had really happened. They learned about the romantic triangle. They discovered the confrontation the previous day near Floor and Dick. They examined Daniel's phone and found evidence that someone had used it to lure Ashley to the apartment. And then came the devastating news: Ashley Bocanegra had died from her injuries. What had been an assault case instantly became a murder investigation. Detectives returned to the apartment to notify Antonetta and Janine of Ashley's death. Body cam footage captured the moment. When officers told Antonetta that Ashley had died, her response was chilling in its casualness. "She died?" Antonetta said, her tone almost dismissive. "Okay. Wow. I'm so sorry about that. That was not my intention." There was no genuine remorse in her voice, no horror at what she'd done. Instead, Antonetta immediately tried to shift blame, claiming that Ashley had shown up here, and that the fight had been mutual. She then complained that she'd been mentally going through a lot, and mentioned that she had bipolar depression, as if this somehow excused the lethal violence. Behind Antonetta, Janine stood silently in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Both women were taken to the police station for formal interviews. The interrogation footage, later released to the public, would prove disturbing. In her police interview, Antonetta maintained her story that the fight had been mutual, that Ashley had arrived looking for trouble. She portrayed herself as the victim, a wronged woman who had simply reacted to provocation. When detectives confronted her with evidence that contradicted her claims, particularly the video that Janine had recorded, Antonetta's composure began to crack. The video told a very different story from the one Antonetta was selling. It showed a premeditated attack, a brutal ambush of an unsuspecting woman. It captured Antonetta's threats to murder Ashley. It recorded Janine's active participation in the violence. When detectives informed Antonetta that she was being charged with felony murder, robbery, and aggravated battery, her head fell to the table. She insisted to investigators, "I don't go out looking to harm anybody. It wasn't my intention to even get into an altercation with her today." But intentions matter little when actions result in death. The video evidence was damning. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Ashley had sustained injuries consistent with a severe beating, not a mutual fight. In a separate interrogation room, Janine Gonzalez's interview revealed an even more disturbing lack of awareness. Throughout much of the questioning, Janine laughed and joked, seemingly unconcerned. She minimized her role, claiming she'd barely touched Ashley, that she'd only pulled her hair. But then detectives showed her the video she'd recorded. They pointed out the moments where she'd kicked Ashley in the chest and back. They referenced a text message that Ashley had sent to Daniel before she died. A message that read, "I was fine until your sister kicked me in the chest and back area." When detectives informed Janine that she was also being charged with murder, her demeanor changed instantly. The smile vanished. Her jaw dropped. "Me?" she gasped. "Whoa, that's too bad. Murder? I barely laid hands on her. All I did was pull her hair." The reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate. This wasn't a game. This wasn't entertainment. A woman was dead, and Janine had played an active role in killing her. Antonetta Stevens and Janine Gonzalez were formally charged with felony murder, aggravated battery, and robbery. They were held without bond as the case moved through the legal system. The charges reflected the severity of the crime. Felony murder in Georgia occurs when someone dies during the commission of another felony, in this case aggravated battery and robbery. The prosecution didn't need to prove that Antonetta and Janine intended to kill Ashley, only that their felonious actions directly resulted in her death. The robbery charge stemmed from the fact that they had taken Ashley's cell phone during the attack. The aggravated battery charge reflected the brutal nature of the assault itself. For months, both women sat in the Gwinnett County Jail, awaiting their fate. Janine's defense attorneys argued that she should be charged with involuntary manslaughter rather than felony murder, suggesting that she was merely a bystander who got caught up in Antonetta's rage. But the video evidence made that argument difficult to sustain. Janine hadn't been a passive bystander, she had actively participated. She had filmed the violence as if it were entertainment. She had kicked Ashley multiple times in vital areas. Eventually, both women accepted plea deals. Rather than risk trial and potentially face life sentences, they pleaded guilty to lesser charges of voluntary manslaughter and robbery by force. In their sentencing hearings, both Antonetta Stevens and Janine Gonzalez received 20-year prison sentences. They were sent to Arendelle State Prison to begin serving their time. 20 years. 2 decades in which to contemplate the choices they made on that August morning. 20 years while Ashley's son grows up without his mother. 20 years that will never bring Ashley back, never undo the damage, never restore what was taken. For Ashley's family, the sentencing brought no real closure. Her sister, Jessica Roche, spoke to media outlets about the devastation of losing Ashley. She described the horrific injuries her sister sustained, the fact that Ashley couldn't breathe, that doctors had to intubate her, that she died before surgeons could even attempt to repair the damage. Ashley's cousin, Brianna Jameson, spoke about the jealousy that motivated the attack. "I'm very angry with those girls," she said. "They're lucky the cops got them. She was beautiful inside and out, so I can see why they were jealous. And jealousy is the ugly trait to have." The family set up a fundraiser to cover Ashley's funeral expenses. The response from the community was overwhelming. Strangers who had never met Ashley donated because they were moved by her story, horrified by the senseless violence that had taken her life. Ashley was laid to rest, her family and friends gathering to remember a woman who had been full of life, who had moved to Georgia seeking a better future, who had loved her son with everything she had. The funeral was a celebration of her life, but also a stark reminder of how quickly everything can be taken away. For Ashley's son, now growing up without his mother, the loss is immeasurable. He will have memories of her, photographs, stories from family members, but he will also have an absence, a hole where his mother should be, milestones she should have witnessed, but never will. Julian Reyes, Ashley's co-parent and the father of her child, also carries the weight of what happened. He was the one who rushed Ashley to the hospital. He witnessed her final moments of consciousness. He now raises their son alone, bearing the responsibility of explaining to a child why his mother is gone. And what of Daniel Gonzalez, the man at the center of this tragic love triangle? He faced no criminal charges. His role was that of a catalyst, a man whose dishonesty and cowardice set events in motion but who was not present when the violence occurred. Daniel gave statements to investigators, expressing shock at what Antonetta and his sister had done, but he also bore the guilt of knowing that his choices, his deception, his inability to be honest with either woman had contributed to the circumstances that led to Ashley's death. The case captured national attention when the police interrogation footage was released to the public in August of 2024, 2 years after Ashley's murder. Millions of people watched the videos on social media. Horrified by Antonetta's callous reaction to learning of Ashley's death, disturbed by Janine's laughter during her interview, outraged by the brutality captured in the attack video, the story became a cautionary tale about jealousy, about the dangers of romantic entanglement, about the devastating consequences when emotions override reason. As we reach the end of Ashley's story, take a moment to breathe deeply and reflect on the fragility of life. Ashley Bocanegra was not a perfect person. None of us are. She made choices that were complicated, that involved deception and hurt. She became involved with a man who was committed to someone else, and that decision had consequences. But nothing Ashley did justified what happened to her. No romantic transgression, no matter how painful to those involved, warrants violence. No betrayal deserves a death sentence delivered by fists and feet on a Georgia apartment complex parking lot. This case reveals something profoundly troubling about how we sometimes handle emotional pain. When Antonetta Stevens discovered her partner's infidelity, she had choices. She could have left Daniel. She could have confronted him directly. She could have processed her pain through conversation, through therapy, through the support of friends and family. Instead, she chose violence. She chose to blame Ashley rather than the man who had actually betrayed her. She chose revenge over reason. And in making those choices, she destroyed not only Ashley's life but her own as well. Janine Gonzalez, barely more than a child herself at 17, made the catastrophic choice to involve herself in her brother's personal affairs. She chose to tell Antonetta about the affair. She chose to participate in the attack. She chose to film it, to laugh during it, to treat lethal violence as entertainment. Those choices will define the next 20 years of her life. The ripples from that one violent morning in August extend far and wide. A 7-year-old boy lost his mother. Parents lost their daughter. Sisters lost their sibling. Friends lost someone they loved. The floor and decor staff lost a manager and colleague. Daniel Gonzalez lost both women in his life and gained the knowledge that his actions played a role in a death. Even Antonetta's children lost their mother to prison, victims themselves of her choices. The 9-year-old and 3-year-old she was raising will spend the next 2 decades visiting their mother behind bars, if they visit at all. There are no winners in this story. Only loss, grief, and the permanent consequences of temporary rage. As you continue to rest and let sleep approach, consider the lessons embedded in this tragedy. Human emotions are powerful forces. Jealousy, betrayal, anger. These feelings can consume us if we let them. But we always have a choice in how we respond to pain. We can choose to communicate rather than attack. We can choose to leave rather than stay in situations that hurt us. We can choose to process our emotions in healthy ways rather than letting them explode into violence. Ashley's story is also a reminder about honesty in relationships. Daniel Gonzalez's dishonesty created the conditions for tragedy. His inability to be truthful with either woman, to make a clear choice, to end one relationship before beginning another, these failures of character had devastating consequences. If there is anything to be learned from this heartbreaking case, it is that we must treat others and ourselves with more care. We must communicate honestly, even when it's difficult. We must process our pain without making it someone else's burden to bear. We must remember that every person we encounter is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved friend. Ashley Bocanegra deserved better. She deserved to watch her son grow up. She deserved to build the life she'd moved to Georgia to create. She deserved to make mistakes and learn from them, to find real love eventually, to grow old and watch grandchildren play. Instead, her life was cut short by a brutal act of violence, an act that solved nothing, healed nothing, and created only more pain in the world. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a real story about lives lived, choices made, and a system that failed to protect those who needed it most. This is the story of Michelle Melendez and her daughter Layla Stewart. It's a story that takes us from the quiet neighborhoods of Vancouver, Washington, to the dusty roads of rural Arkansas. It's about a mother's love, a community's grief, and questions that still echo through courtrooms and family homes. Vancouver, Washington sits just across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. It's a city of neighborhoods and apartment complexes, of working families and Sunday morning routines. In the Minnehaha area of Vancouver, in one of those apartment buildings, lived a 27-year-old woman named Michelle Melendez. Those who knew her remembered her spirit. Her brother Ricardo would later describe her as someone full of life, someone whose presence could fill a room. She had that quality some people possess, that magnetic energy that draws others in. Her laugh was distinctive, memorable, the kind of laugh that once you heard it, you'd recognize it anywhere. Michelle was a mother. Her daughter Layla Stewart was 7 years old in the spring of 2023. Layla too had inherited that same infectious energy, that same goofy laugh her mother carried. The two were close in a way that transcends the typical mother-daughter bond. They were companions. Every weekend, Layla would stay with her aunt Leshay Gates, creating memories that would become precious beyond measure. Michelle's mother, Nicole Norris, cherished her weekly video chats with her daughter and granddaughter. It was a routine, a ritual that connected 3 generations. Every week without fail, they would connect through a screen, sharing their lives across whatever distance separated them. Life in Vancouver moved at its own pace for Michelle and Layla. School days and work days, weekends with family, the ordinary rhythms that make up a life, but orbiting around them was a presence that would shatter that ordinary life completely. His name was Kirkland Warren. To understand what happened in Vancouver, we must first travel south and back in time. Back to November 27, 2017, back to Arkansas. Kirkland Warren was 22 years old then. He lived in Pine Bluff, a city in southeastern Arkansas, with a population of around 40,000 people. His father, Donald Warren, had once been both an attorney and a judge in Jefferson County, though he had resigned from the bench years earlier amid allegations of misconduct. The Warren name carried weight in those parts, a fact that would become significant as events unfolded. On that November day in 2017, Warren was at a notary's office in Pine Bluff with a man named Curtis Urquhart. Curtis was 57 years old, a resident of Pine Bluff living his own ordinary life until that day. The notary later recalled watching the 2 men leave her office together. Warren was driving. Curtis was his passenger. They drove away in a Hyundai Sonata, headed out of town. What happened next, we know from Warren's own words. He would later tell police that as they drove, Curtis repeatedly asked him for money. Warren said he refused. According to his statement, he became fearful for his life. While driving, he reached under the driver's seat, pulled out a .22 caliber handgun, and shot Curtis Urquhart in the head. Curtis died instantly. Warren didn't stop driving. He continued down rural roads until he found what he was looking for, a gravel road near Stuttgart, Arkansas. Remote, quiet. He pulled Curtis's body from the car and left it in a ditch by the side of the road. Then he drove home. 10 days passed. 10 days of Curtis Urquhart lying in that ditch. On December 11, 2017, 3 men were driving down that same gravel road when they pulled over. One of them needed to use the restroom. As he stepped away from the truck, he saw something in the ditch, a body, a man lying on his back, motionless. They called 911 immediately. When investigators began piecing together Curtis's final movements, they discovered the notary's office, the appointment, the man who had driven away with him. They brought Kirkland Warren in for questioning on December 12th. Warren admitted to the shooting. He explained about the money, about his fear, about pulling that trigger while behind the wheel. He was arrested that same day. The next day, just one day after his arrest, a Jefferson County District Court judge set Warren's bond at $250,000. Warren posted that bond. He walked out of jail on December 13, 2017. The system had made its first decision about Kirkland Warren. Despite admitting to shooting a man in the head and dumping his body in a ditch, despite the severity of the charges, first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse, Warren was deemed appropriate for release on bail. The sheriff would later explain that Warren came from a notable family, that he didn't seem like a flight risk, that he had no criminal history that raised red flags. No ankle monitor was required, no GPS tracking. Warren was free to go wherever he wished, as long as he appeared for court dates. In February 2018, the formal charges were filed in circuit court. The bond remained the same, $250,000. Warren remained free. And then, as often happens in the American justice system, the case began to drag. Trial dates were set and postponed. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived, causing delays. Witnesses became ill. Evidence took time to process. Months became years. Kirkland Warren moved to Washington State, to Vancouver, to a new life, with a pending murder charge hanging over him like a distant cloud that never seemed to rain. We don't know exactly when or how Mache Melendez and Kirkland Warren met. What we know is that by late 2022, they were in a relationship. We also know that it was not a healthy one. Domestic violence rarely announces itself all at once. It creeps in, often masked as love or concern, or jealousy framed as caring. Warning signs appear that, in hindsight, seem obvious but in the moment can be explained away, rationalized, forgiven. On December 13, 2022, Mache and Warren argued at her apartment in the Minnehaha neighborhood. The specifics of the argument are lost to time, known only to the two people who were there. What happened next is documented. Warren left the apartment. Mache went to her balcony window. Perhaps to watch him leave, perhaps to get air, perhaps just to look out at the night. Warren got into his vehicle. He didn't drive away immediately. Instead, as Mache looked out from her balcony, Warren fired a gun toward her apartment. The bullet struck near the balcony window where she stood. Mache was terrified. Too terrified. She would later tell police to report it immediately. She had her friend hang up a 911 call that had been placed in response to the shooting. 10 days passed before she found the courage to make an official report. On December 23, 2022, Mache called police again. This time, she reported that Warren had physically assaulted her. She also told them about the shooting incident from 10 days earlier. A friend of Mache's corroborated her account of the shooting. The Vancouver Police Department began investigating. They interviewed witnesses. They gathered evidence. But investigations take time, and while they investigated, Mache remained in her apartment, and Warren remained free. Then something happened that demonstrates the complexity and heartbreak of domestic violence situations. On February 17, 2023, Mache met with investigators again. This time she recanted her earlier statement. She told police she had lied about the shooting. She claimed that both she and her friend had mental health and drug issues, suggesting their earlier statements were unreliable. She asked that Warren not be arrested. We'll never know what pressure Mache may have been under when she made that recantation. We'll never know what fears drove her to take back her words, to protect the man who had shot at her. This is the terrible reality of domestic violence. Victims often protect their abusers, caught in cycles of fear, manipulation, hope, and trauma. But the investigation continued. The physical evidence remained. The corroborating witness stood by their story. On March 31st, 2021, over a year before the shooting at Mache's apartment, Warren had walked into Safefire, a gun shop in Camas, Washington. He wanted to purchase a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. He filled out the required application. When asked if he was under indictment for a felony, he checked no. He was lying. The murder case in Arkansas was still pending. He was absolutely under indictment for a felony. His application was denied, but Warren didn't give up on obtaining firearms. By December 2022, he had access to guns, as the shooting at Mache's apartment demonstrated. In March 2023, police would discover he possessed a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber used to kill Curtis Urquhart years earlier. They would also discover he had a stolen semi-automatic handgun. On March 2nd, 2023, Vancouver police arrested Warren. The charges were serious and multiple: second-degree domestic violence assault, drive-by shooting, making a false statement on the gun application, harassment, and possession of a stolen firearm. On March 3rd, Warren made his first court appearance. Clark County prosecutors presented their case to Judge Suzanne Clark. They had conducted a danger assessment, a standardized tool used to evaluate the risk a domestic violence perpetrator poses to their victim. The scale typically runs from 1 to 18. Warren scored a 31. The prosecutors highlighted the extreme danger Warren posed to Mache. They pointed to the pending murder case in Arkansas. They asked the judge to set Warren's bail at $100,000. Judge Clark agreed. Bail was set at $100,000. A domestic violence no-contact order was issued, legally barring Warren from any contact with Mache Melendez. He was also prohibited from possessing any firearms, and was restricted from traveling outside of Clark County nearby Cowlitz County and the Portland metropolitan area. Warren couldn't immediately post bail. He remained in the Clark County jail. Hours after the no-contact order was issued, Warren violated it. From his jail cell he called Mache twice. In those recorded calls, Warren blamed Mache for his arrest. He pressured her to find a way to get the charges dropped. He was manipulating her even from behind bars. A Vancouver Police Department sergeant who specialized in domestic violence cases saw what was happening. The sergeant filed a declaration of probable cause, requesting that the court raise Warren's bail even higher and require him to wear a GPS ankle monitor if he was released. The request detailed Warren's dangerous history, his violations of court orders, the threat he posed. But the legal system moves through different courts, and complications arose. The case moved from district court to superior court. In that transfer on March 7, 2023, the domestic violence charges were dismissed from district court with the understanding they would be added to Warren's superior court case. In that transition, the request for GPS monitoring fell through the cracks. On March 8, 2023, 5 days after his arrest, Kirkland Warren posted the $100,000 bail. He walked out of jail with no ankle monitor, no GPS tracking, only the no-contact order, which he had already violated twice from jail. Mache Melendez was not notified immediately of his release. On March 11, 2023, just 3 days after Warren's release, Mache, Layla, and Warren stayed together at a friend's apartment in the Van Mall neighborhood of Vancouver. The friend would later tell investigators about that night. Despite the no-contact order, despite the danger assessment, despite everything, Michelle was with Warren again. This is another painful reality of domestic violence. The orders of protection, the legal barriers, the warnings, they only work if everyone obeys them. And abusers, by definition, do not respect boundaries. The next morning, March 12th, at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, Michelle, Layla, and Warren arrived at another friend's home. They asked this friend to watch Layla. The friend agreed. This friend was the last person, other than Warren, to see Michelle and Layla alive. Around 8 o'clock that morning, Warren returned to the friend's house. The friend looked out and saw Michelle slumped in the passenger seat of Warren's Dodge Charger. She appeared to be passed out, unconscious. Warren went inside, collected Layla, and drove away with her. Michelle's mother, Nicole Norris, tried to reach her daughter for their weekly video chat. No response. Days passed. Still no response. Friends reported they couldn't contact Michelle either. By March 18th, 6 days after that last morning sighting, Nicole Norris was frantic. She filed a missing persons report. Vancouver police began their investigation immediately. They started with the last known person to see them, Kirkland Warren. On March 19th, they obtained search warrants for Warren's residence and his vehicles. What they found painted a horrifying picture. Inside Warren's 2021 Dodge Charger, the car the friend had seen Michelle unconscious in, investigators found blood evidence in both the front and back seats. They found 2 .22 caliber shell casings. They found children's clothing identified as Layla's. They found a purse containing Michelle's driver's license. In Warren's second vehicle, a 2020 Hyundai Palisade, they found a .22 caliber pistol in the center console. The brand of ammunition in the pistol matched the shell casings found in the Dodge Charger. Warren was arrested that day on charges of witness tampering and violating the no-contact order. Investigators questioned him. When they asked if he thought law enforcement had found Michelle and Layla, Warren replied, "I don't know." Then he added something chilling, "I hope not." While Warren sat in jail, events were unfolding in Arkansas. On March 14th, prosecutors there filed a motion to revoke Warren's bond in the 2017 murder case, citing his arrest in Vancouver. On March 17th, a judge in Arkansas revoked that bond. If Warren was released in Washington, Arkansas now wanted him back. But more urgently, Vancouver police needed to find Michelle and Layla. East of Washougal, Washington, the urban landscape gives way to rural roads, wooded areas, creeks, places where houses are scattered and roads wind through trees. It's quiet out there, peaceful, the kind of place where you might go to escape the noise of the city. On March 22nd, 2023, someone was driving along a rural road in this area. They saw something that didn't belong, something by the side of the road, near a creek. They pulled over, they got closer, they called 911. Law enforcement arrived quickly. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. 2 bodies, a woman and a child, Michelle Melendez and Layla Stewart, mother and daughter, found together. The medical examiner would later determine that both had been shot in the head. Michelle had been shot once in her left temple. Layla had 2 gunshot wounds to her head. The wounds were consistent with a .22 caliber firearm. Layla's body revealed another horror. She had been found naked from the waist down. The medical examiner performed swabs of her lower body as part of the examination. Those swabs were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for analysis. Investigators used Warren's cell phone records to piece together his movements after March 12th. On the night of March 13th, his phone had pinged off cell towers near Southeast Wooding Road, east of Sunset View Road. This was the exact area where Michelle and Layla's bodies were discovered 9 days later. On March 31st, 2023, The Vancouver Police Department charged Kirkland Warren with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Later, prosecutors would also charge him with unlawful possession of a firearm. In October 2023, lab results came back from the swabs taken from Layla's body. DNA analysis linked the samples to Kirkland Warren. He was charged with first-degree child rape. Warren pleaded not guilty to all charges. His trial was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. The case would take over a year to work through the courts. 77 witnesses were prepared to testify. The trial was expected to last 2 to 3 weeks. Then on September 5, 2024, just days before the trial was set to begin, Warren changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for Meshe's death and aggravated first-degree murder for Layla's death. He entered an Alford plea to first-degree child molestation, allowing him to maintain his innocence while acknowledging the evidence against him was overwhelming. Senior Deputy Prosecutor Toby Kroll later explained that he had offered the plea deal not because the case would be difficult to prove, but to spare Meshe and Layla's family the trauma of a lengthy trial with graphic evidence and testimony. Warren also agreed to plead guilty to the Arkansas charges in the death of Curtis Urquhart. Arkansas agreed not to seek the death penalty, and any sentence there would run concurrent with his Washington sentence. On October 8, 2024, Clark County Superior Court Judge David Gregerson held the sentencing hearing. The courtroom filled with family and friends of Meshe and Layla. Purple balloons, Meshe and Layla's favorite color, had been tied to pillars outside the courthouse. Family members were given the opportunity to address the court and Warren. The room filled with the sound of open sobbing as victim impact statements were read. Nicole Norris wrote to the court, "The day I lost them, I lost a part of myself. A part of me died with my girls. I am no longer a girl mom. I am no longer a grandmother." Lachey Gates, Layla's aunt, spoke about the weekends she would never have again. "I can't even get phone calls from Meshe to say, 'I'm dropping off Layla' or 'I'm picking her up.' I would watch Layla almost every weekend, and when those weekends come back up, I don't get to see her anymore. The 7 years was all I had, and it's all because of Kirkland Warren." Ricardo Melendez, Meshe's brother, called Warren what many were thinking. They were brutally murdered, a soulless being put on this planet, a narcissist. Throughout the statements, Warren sat with his head down, showing little emotion. Judge Gregerson addressed the court. "A crime of this magnitude demands a punishment commensurate with the offense to the victims and to the community. This court sees no persuasive reason why this defendant should not receive the maximum punishment under Washington law. Any possibility of this being some horrific accident or being mitigated in any way is squarely contravened by the depraved way in which Meshe and Layla's bodies were disposed of by this defendant. Because Washington state does not have the death penalty, Judge Gregerson sentenced Warren to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Warren was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, people shouted at him, 'Child molester, coward.' Outside the courthouse, as family and friends gathered around their purple balloons, one balloon slipped from someone's grasp. It floated up into the sky. 'That was either Meshe or Layla,' someone said quietly. Then they deliberately released another balloon, watching it join the first, rising together into the endless sky. Michelle Bart, president of the National Women's Coalition Against Violence and Exploitation, stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing. She voiced what many in the community were thinking. Meshe and Layla should still be alive today. The questions echo through every conversation about this case. How was Kirkland Warren free? How did a man with a pending murder charge in Arkansas, a danger assessment score of 31, and a history of violating court orders from jail end up walking free without any monitoring? The Melendez family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Clark County in September 2024. The lawsuit argues that the county negligently put Michelle and Layla in danger by releasing Warren without proper safeguards. The lawsuit points to the request for GPS monitoring that fell through the cracks during the transfer between courts. It questions why a judge granted bail at all given Warren's history. The family's attorney wrote, "Defendant Clark County Probation's negligence was the direct and proximate cause of Warren's campaign of violence that resulted in the deaths of Michelle and Layla." Clark County declined to comment on the pending litigation. In Arkansas, Sheriff Lafayette Woods defended the original decision to grant Warren bail in the Curtis Urquhart case. He pointed to Warren's family connections, his lack of apparent flight risk, his clean record before the Urquhart killing. "What I know about the family, well respected, in that time, Warren didn't seem to be an individual that would be capable of committing such a heinous crime. But the patterns were there." After the Urquhart killing in 2017, investigators would discover that Warren had searched Google for incriminating phrases: how to get blood out of a car seat, how to beat murder, killing the only witness. The signs were there for anyone looking closely enough. The broader questions extend beyond this individual case. How many other defendants are free on bail with pending violent felonies? How many protective orders exist on paper but lack the enforcement mechanisms to make them meaningful? How many victims recant their statements under pressure, leaving the system uncertain how to proceed? Tara Verde Trejo, a family friend, spoke at the 2-year anniversary of finding Michelle and Layla's bodies. "We still are seeking answers why he did not have the ankle monitor on. The month is very hard for all of us. So many aunts, uncles, brothers, cousins, grandmas, great-grandmas." Nicole Norris, who will never again have her weekly video chat with her daughter and granddaughter, has become an advocate. She questions not just the specific failures in her family's case, but the systemic issues that allow such tragedies to occur. "I understand that they were murdered, and certain things happened to them, but I feel like everybody wants to talk about the gruesome murders but not, how did we get here? People are dying every day. I'm not acting like the girls are the only ones that've been through this. This is happening everywhere. But if things aren't done, how are we supposed to save certain people?" It would be easy to let this story end in the darkness of the crimes committed, but that's not how the people who loved Michelle and Layla remember them. They remember Michelle's energy, her presence, the way she could light up a space. They remember her as a dedicated mother, a loving daughter, a cherished sister and friend. They remember Layla, at 7 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. They remember her goofy laugh that matched her mother's. They remember weekend visits with her aunt, the bond between them, the simple joy of a child who was loved and knew she was loved. "Just full of life," Tara Verde Trejo said. "They were fun to be around. Michelle and the baby both had a goofy laugh. They're just missed so much." The funeral for Michelle and Layla drew hundreds of people from the Vancouver community. Purple was everywhere, on flowers, on clothing, on balloons. The service celebrated their lives while acknowledging the terrible way those lives ended. In the months and years since, the family has worked to keep their memories alive, not through the manner of their deaths, but through the content of their lives. They've shared photos of happier times. They've told stories. They've tried to ensure that when people hear the names Michelle Melendez and Layla Stewart, they think first of the people they were, not the tragedy that befell them. That's what families do in the aftermath of such violence. They reclaim the narrative. They refuse to let the perpetrator's actions define their loved one's entire existence. Michelle and Layla lived 27 and 7 years respectively. Years filled with love, laughter, relationships, memories. That's what deserves to be remembered. As of early 2025, Kirkland Warren remains in the Washington Corrections Center in Shelton, Washington. He will spend the rest of his life there. The paperwork for his guilty plea in the Arkansas case has been delayed due to administrative issues, but he will eventually enter that plea as well, adding another life sentence that will run concurrent with his current one. Curtis Urquhart's family waited over 6 years for any resolution in his case. Miche's and Layla's family waited over a year and a half. The wheels of justice grind slowly, and for those left behind, every day of waiting is another day without answers, without closure, without their loved ones. The civil lawsuit against Clark County continues through the courts. Whatever its outcome, no amount of money can return what was lost. In Vancouver, life continues. The apartment where Miche and Layla lived has new tenants now. The Menaha neighborhood goes about its daily business. Children play, families live their lives. The ordinary moments that Miche and Layla will never have pile up, day after day, moment after moment. Nicole Norris faces each day without her weekly video chat. Lachey Gates faces weekends without her niece. Ricardo Melendez faces a world without his sister and niece. The ripples of violence extend far beyond the immediate victims, touching dozens, hundreds of lives in ways large and small. This is the true cost that's hard to quantify in court proceedings and news reports. The accumulation of all the moments that will never happen. First days of school, graduations, birthdays, holidays, the mundane Tuesday afternoons, the lazy Sunday mornings, all of it gone. The murder of Miche Melendez and Layla Stewart is a story without easy answers. It's a story about the failures of multiple systems, the bail system, the domestic violence response system, the information sharing between jurisdictions. It's about the difficulty of protecting people who sometimes don't want protection, caught in the complicated dynamics of abusive relationships. But more than anything, it's a story about two people who deserved to live, who deserved protection, who deserved better than what the system gave them. Their names were Miche Melendez and Layla Stewart. They lived, they laughed, they loved and were loved. And then, because a dangerous man was free when he shouldn't have been, they died. Remember them not for how their story ended, but for the lives they lived. Remember them in the purple balloons floating up into the sky. Remember them in the laughter that echoed through family gatherings. Remember them in the fierce love between a mother and daughter. Remember them. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far. The first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet, affluent town of Dover, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. It's a story about secrets, about the facades we build, and about the devastating price of silence. Let your breathing slow as we begin. This is the story of Tina Kamal, a woman who lived a life of apparent success, surrounded by wealth and community standing, yet who knew nothing of the storm gathering around her. It was December 28, 2023, just after the Christmas holiday. The decorations still hung on the houses along Wilson's Way in Dover, Massachusetts. This was one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in one of the wealthiest states in America. The homes here sat on sprawling lots, estates hidden behind gates and long driveways. Snow might have dusted the manicured lawns. Holiday lights still twinkled in the winter dusk. At number 8 Wilson's Way stood a mansion. Not just a large house, but a true mansion. 19,000 square feet, 27 rooms, 11 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, a home theater, a spa, an indoor pool, the kind of house that whispers wealth, The kind of house that suggests everything is going exactly right, but something was wrong. Manoj Kamal, a man in his 50s, drove to his brother's house that evening. He hadn't heard from his brother Rakesh, his sister-in-law Tina, or their 18-year-old daughter Ariana in a day or two. Not unusual, perhaps. Families get busy. The holidays are chaotic. But something nagged at him, a feeling, an instinct that something wasn't quite right. When he arrived, the house was quiet, too quiet. An alarm was blaring inside, piercing the stillness. The front door stood open. Manoj called out. No answer. He stepped inside. The alarm's wail filled the enormous house. He moved through the rooms, calling their names. Then he found her. Ariana, their daughter, in her bedroom. Blood on the sheets. She wasn't moving. She would never move again. Manoj didn't lift the sheets in the other bedroom he passed. He had seen enough. At 7:24 that evening, he called 911. His voice shook as he spoke to the operator. He gave the wrong address at first, confusion and shock clouding his mind. When police arrived minutes later, they found what Manoj had found, and more. 3 bodies. A family, gone. Rakesh Kamal, 57 years old. Tina Kamal, 54. Their daughter Ariana, just 18, home from her first semester at Middlebury College in Vermont. Near Rakesh's body, investigators found a .40 caliber Glock 22, unregistered, unlicensed, a weapon he had no legal right to possess. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been inside. The evidence pointed to one horrific conclusion. This was not an outside threat. This was a family destroyed from within. To understand what happened in that mansion on Wilson's Way, we need to go back to who these people were, or at least, who they appeared to be. Tina and Rakesh Kamal seemed to have it all. They'd met through an arranged marriage when Rakesh, who went by Rick, was in his early 20s. Tina was born Tina Bedi, originally from India, educated at Delhi University. Rick graduated from Boston University's College of Engineering in 1987. Both found work at Fidelity Investments in Boston, building careers in technology and finance. Their daughter Ariana came along in 2005. Friends called her Arya, or Ari. The family settled first in a 5-bedroom colonial in Marlborough, Massachusetts. By all accounts, they lived comfortably. Rick once told an interviewer that life had its challenges, but they were all worth it for the blessings of a peaceful home. The neighbors in Marlborough would later describe the Kamals as polite but private. They kept to themselves. One neighbor who lived next to them for 20 years didn't even know they had a daughter. The Kamals occupied their space quietly, cordially, but never let anyone too close. Rick worked in the education technology field. For several years from 2015 to 2019, he held a position at Harvard Business School online as managing director and chief technology officer. It was prestigious work at a prestigious institution. On the surface, everything gleamed. Tina, too, built an impressive resume. She'd worked at Fidelity, at EMC Corporation, at Aegis Software. Her LinkedIn profile boasted of her experience developing consumer education products, of breakthrough customer service technology, of patents pending. She was active in the community, joining boards, volunteering with the American Red Cross, eventually serving on the regional board of directors. She became part of the Tiffany Circle, a group of women who donated $10,000 or more annually to the organization. Their daughter Ariana attended the prestigious Milton Academy, a private boarding school. Tina served as president of the Upper School Parents Association there for 2 years, organizing events, facilitating webinars during the pandemic, known as someone who did it all. Her vice president called her the Ginger Rogers of Milton Academy, graceful, tireless, always moving. Ariana graduated from Milton in the spring of 2023. Teachers remembered her as sweet, smart, kind, a beautiful poet, one said, a brilliant student with a passion for music, another recalled. She tutored immigrant children. She interned at Mass General Brigham. She sang in the college choir at Middlebury, where she'd just begun studying neuroscience that fall. She wanted to become a neuroscientist, but opera was her passion too. She dreamed of traveling to Italy to study and perform. By all outward appearances, the Kamals were the American dream realized. Immigrants who worked hard, who built careers, who gave their daughter every advantage. They moved to Dover in February 2019, purchasing their mansion on Wilson's Way for $4 million. The house sat on just over 5 acres. It had everything. It was the crown jewel of their success, but appearances, as we know, can deceive. At the center of the Kamals' professional life was a company called Edunova. Rick and Tina founded it in 2016. According to the company's website, Edunova developed a student success system called MCS3, designed to help middle school, high school, and college students improve their grades. They claim to work with top university faculty and business executives to create resources that would prepare students to lead and thrive in the global economy. Rick served as president. Tina was chief operating officer. Their biographies on the website were impressive. Rick stated he was an alumnus of Boston University, MIT Sloan School of Management, and Stanford University. Tina's claimed she graduated magna cum laude from Delhi University and was an alumnus of Harvard University. Rick made media appearances in 2012 to discuss study skills. The company's website remained active through the summer of 2023, but behind the polished facade there were cracks. After the deaths, investigators looked more closely at Edunova. The credentials the Kamals had listed turned out to be exaggerated. MIT confirmed that Rick had never attended the Sloan School of Management as a degree student. He'd merely taken some executive courses and received a certificate. Harvard had no record of Tina ever attending. The biographies also listed Tina's brother, Sandeep Bedi, and his wife on the staff page, but both said they'd never been involved with the company. It's unclear how much investment Edunova actually attracted or how many customers it served. The company did receive a $150,000 grant from the National Science Foundation, and at some point it received an investment from Andrew and Michelle Miller. Andrew was the chief operating officer of Karuna Therapeutics, a Boston biotech company. The Millers lived in Dover as well, and in October 2020, they purchased a 10-acre lot on Wilson's Way, but the Millers were never paid back. Eventually their investment was converted into a $1.5 million mortgage on the Kamals' home in July 2022. In December 2021, Edunova was officially dissolved by the state of Massachusetts. The reason appeared to be failure to file annual reports for 2 years in a row. The morning after the Kamals' bodies were found, the company's website was taken down. Rick and Tina's LinkedIn accounts disappeared. The company that had been the center of their professional identity was gone, and with it went any remaining pretense that things were fine. The full scale of Rick Kamal's financial collapse only became clear after the deaths. The mansion they'd bought for $4 million was purchased with a $3.8 million mortgage from the home's builder Wilson Dale Associates. The terms required the full amount to be paid in 2 years, but by February 2021, the Kamals were already trying to restructure. According to their mortgage modification agreement, they still owed $3.61 million plus more than $300,000 in unpaid interest and fines. The situation only worsened. In September 2022, a Chapter 13 bankruptcy petition was filed in Tina's name. She listed liabilities between $1 million and $10 million, but the case was dismissed within a month because Tina failed to file the necessary documents. In December 2022, Wilsondale filed a foreclosure deed on the home. The Kamals were served an order to vacate in late December 2022. They were served with eviction proceedings in May 2023. By December 2023, Metro South Housing Court had issued an execution allowing Wilsondale to enforce the eviction. The deadline was December 28th. The same day the family's bodies were discovered, but Rick's debts extended far beyond the mortgage. He borrowed $550,000 from a man named Andy Petchik in November 2020, promising to pay it back in 4 months for a deal with an Indian education technology company called MBB. The loan was never repaid. The MBB deal fell through. In 2021, Rick told Petchik he was traveling to China to set up a new deal for Agenova. Then he stopped responding to messages. In September 2021, Tina emailed one of Petchik's associates saying Rick had fallen ill while abroad. In March 2022, she said Rick had been moved to Mass General Hospital. In May, she wrote that if Rick hadn't improved by September, they would dissolve and liquidate their assets to pay their debts. September came and went. She wrote that they were unwinding things and would have payment available in January. January came and went. The money never materialized. Rick also borrowed money from family. He took a substantial sum from his brother Manoj. He took money from his mother and from Tina's brother Sandeep Bedi. He borrowed approximately $500,000. Rick begged Betty not to tell Tina, and Betty didn't. He trusted Rick. They all did. After the deaths, a Maryland company called Entech Connect filed a claim against Rick's estate. They'd loaned $550,000 to Cambetas, a company Rick operated, in December 2022. It was supposed to be repaid in 4 months. As the deadline approached, Rick's communications grew sporadic. He claimed he'd be able to repay the loan once he received an international wire transfer. He later wrote that he was in China, meeting with authorities about his access to funds. Meanwhile, even as debts piled up, Rick was looking at buying another house. A $16.5 million waterfront estate on Chickamauga Lake in Tennessee. He'd been in contact with a listing agent since October 2022. He apparently provided bank statements proving his ability to purchase. The family toured the house in August 2023. Rick told the agent he was going on a business trip to China and wouldn't be able to communicate via email or text. They reached a verbal agreement. The agent sent a contract. Rick never signed it. He kept dangling the possibility, kept talking about the deal, kept the agent believing the sale might happen. Back in Dover, Tina was buying furniture for what she believed would be their second home. She had no idea. Tina Kamal didn't know. That's what everyone said afterward. Her brother Sandeep Bedi was adamant. Tina had no clue that there were financial problems, he told investigators. She thought that they were rolling in money. Rihanna didn't know either. While her father battled creditors, fought off eviction, borrowed from anyone who would lend to him, his wife and daughter lived in blissful ignorance. They saw the mansion, the cars, the private schools, the promising future. They saw a man who seemed to have it all under control. How did Rick hide it? How does anyone hide a catastrophe of that magnitude from the people sleeping in the same house? It takes meticulous deception, intercepting mail, managing all financial correspondence, keeping control of every document, every statement, every phone call from creditors. Even as the net tightened, Rick maintained the facade. On December 24th, 2023, Christmas Eve, a fax was sent to Genworth, the company holding Tina's $1.25 million life insurance policy. The fax requested adding Manoj Kamal, Rick's brother, as a backup or contingent beneficiary. For 3 decades, Rick had been the primary beneficiary with Ariana as backup. Now that changed. On Christmas Day, just after midnight, the Kamal family had a FaceTime call with Tina's family in India. Her relatives later described the conversation as happy and loving, nothing out of the ordinary. Tina and Ariana seemed fine. Rick seemed fine. On December 26th, Rick texted his brother Manoji to cancel a scheduled get-together for the next day. He claimed Tina and Ariana had been hospitalized from an allergic reaction to eating shrimp. It was a lie. They weren't in the hospital. They were home. That same day, Rick was in constant communication with Stephen Bisson, who worked for Wilsondale Associates. The eviction was imminent. Rick agreed to leave the keys on the kitchen table, but he opined that he'd know better by the start of the new year whether he'd have the funds to one day move back in. He still believed, or at least pretended to believe, that he could turn things around. A typed note would later be found in the house. Its contents haven't been fully disclosed, but it pointed to the depths of Rick's desperation. On December 28th, the day they were supposed to be evicted, Manoj went to check on the family. He found them dead. The medical examiner's autopsy confirmed what investigators suspected. Tina and Ariana had been shot multiple times in the head. They were in their beds. They were likely asleep. They never knew what was coming. Rick was found in a second-floor bathtub. He'd turned the gun on himself. The wound was consistent with being self-inflicted. In the days and weeks that followed, the story emerged piece by piece. Investigators released their findings. The Boston Globe conducted extensive reporting, uncovering the full scope of Rick's deceptions and debts. Family members spoke to the press, their voices heavy with grief and disbelief. Sandeep Bedi, Tina's brother, told reporters how he struggled to reconcile the man he thought he knew with the man who committed these acts. "We put him on a pedestal so high you cannot imagine," Bedi said. "So now, for us to reconcile not just that he murdered my sister and my niece, but that he was lying to us for years, it just cannot even sink in." Bedi also said that Rick had approached him for that $500,000 loan and begged him not to tell Tina. "I would never in my wildest dreams question what Rick is doing," Bedi said, but the truth was darker than any of them could have imagined. At Milton Academy, where Ariana had just graduated, grief counselors were made available. The school described her as a sweet, smart, kind young woman who was just beginning to realize her full potential. At Middlebury College, where she'd spent just one semester, a memorial was held. The college choir sang in her memory. Friends spoke of her quirky sense of humor, her brilliant mind, her love of opera and poetry. One friend, her boyfriend, told the Globe that Ariana saw all the good and all the beauty in the world, and that she could make you see it too. "She truly made you feel like the only person in the world when she spoke to you," he said. Love and light just radiated from her. 3 colleagues of Rick's from Harvard Business School Online said it was well known in the office that Rick had been pushed out of his position years earlier. The reasons weren't entirely clear, but it appeared connected to a transgression related to a competing business. Yet Rick never let on to his family that he'd lost that job. He kept going, kept pretending, kept building the illusion. The American Red Cross released a statement expressing sadness over Tina's death. She'd been an active and valued board member, someone who gave generously of her time and money. The organization noted the tragedy without fully grasping the complexity behind it. And then there was the life insurance. The $1.25 million policy on Tina's life became the subject of a legal battle. Rick's brother Manoj, the newly added contingent beneficiary, filed a claim to collect the payout, but Tina's brother Sandeep raised concerns about the circumstances of the beneficiary change. Genworth, the insurance company, asked a federal court in Boston to decide who should receive the money. The two sides were given until August 2nd, 2024, to respond, either by settling or preparing for trial. Court documents filed in August indicated the parties agreed to settle, though it's unclear who ultimately received the payout. Creditors also began filing claims. The Intech Connect company sought more than $760,000 from Rick's estate. Others likely followed. The mansion on Wilson's Way, once a symbol of success, became evidence in probate court of a life built on lies. Why did Rick Kamal do it? That's the question everyone asks. Why not just tell Tina the truth? Why not declare bankruptcy properly? Walk away from the house. Start over. Why choose murder and suicide? There are no easy answers. Domestic violence and family annihilation cases are complex. Experts who study these tragedies point to several common factors. Shame, for one. The inability to face the consequences of failure. A man who has built his identity on success, on providing for his family, on being seen as competent and in control, may view financial ruin as an insurmountable catastrophe. There's also a distorted sense of protectiveness. Some perpetrators convince themselves they're sparing their loved ones from suffering. They believe that life after the revelation of such secrets would be unbearable for everyone involved. Of course, this is a delusion. Tina and Ariana would have been devastated to learn the truth. Certainly, they might have felt betrayed, angry, confused, but they would have been alive. They could have rebuilt. They had family who loved them, who would have helped. Rick didn't give them that choice. Sandeep Bedi said after the deaths that had Rick shared the problems with Tina and the family. This was not a problem that could not have been solved. The debt was enormous, yes. The shame would have been immense. But people survive bankruptcy. Families weather financial storms. What they cannot survive is murder. There's also the timing to consider. December 28th was the day of the eviction. It was the day the pretense would finally inevitably collapse. Rick could no longer hide. The locks would be changed. The family would be forced out. Questions would be asked. The truth would come spilling out. He couldn't control it anymore. And control, perhaps, was what mattered most to Rick. For years he'd maintained control through deception. He controlled what Tina knew, what Ariana knew, what the world saw. When that control was about to slip away completely, he made one final horrific choice to control the ending. Norfolk District Attorney Michael Morrissey, speaking to the press in the immediate aftermath, reminded the community that domestic violence crosses all economic and social situations. This happened in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Massachusetts, to a family that looked perfect from the outside. But behind closed doors, a man was unraveling, and when he fell apart, he took two innocent people with him. The deaths of Tina, Ariana, and Rick Kamal sent shockwaves through multiple communities. In Dover, a town where serious crime was almost unheard of, neighbors struggled to comprehend what had happened. The district attorney noted it was only the second death investigation he'd conducted in Dover since taking office. At Milton Academy and Middlebury College, students and faculty mourned. Counseling services were made available. Memorials were planned. People who'd known Ariana tried to make sense of a bright life snuffed out just as it was beginning. The Red Cross mourned the loss of a dedicated board member. Colleagues from Fidelity Investments, from Harvard Business School Online, from the education technology world, all expressed shock. Those who'd lent money to Rick or invested in his ventures were left with losses that went beyond the financial. And the families, both Rick's and Tina's, were left to grapple with the worst kind of grief. The grief of loss compounded by the grief of betrayal. Manoj Kamal, Rick's brother, was the one who discovered the bodies. He called 911. He has to live with those images. Sandeep Bedi, Tina's brother, not only lost his sister and niece, but also had to confront the fact that the man he trusted, the man he loaned money to without question, had been lying for years and ultimately became their killer. In India, Tina's parents learned that their daughter and granddaughter were gone. They'd spoken to the family on Christmas Day, just hours before the murders. Everything had seemed fine. How do you reconcile that final happy conversation with what came next? The case also sparked broader discussions about domestic violence, financial stress, and mental health. Advocacy groups pointed out that December often sees an uptick in domestic violence incidents. The holidays can exacerbate existing tensions. Financial pressures intensify. Family gatherings force confrontations that might otherwise be avoided. But this wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. This was the culmination of years of deception, years of mounting pressure, years of Rick making choice after choice to hide the truth rather than face it. As we near the end of this story, it's worth pausing to reflect on what it reveals about the human condition. We all wear masks to some extent. We present versions of ourselves to the world that may not fully align with the reality of our inner lives. But most of us don't build lies of this magnitude. Most of us, when faced with failure, find a way to be honest, to ask for help, to accept the consequences. Rick Kamal couldn't do that. Or wouldn't. It's impossible to know which. Perhaps he started with small deceptions, each one making the next easier. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could turn things around, that the next deal would save them, that he'd never have to confess. Perhaps he was so deep in denial that he couldn't see the walls closing in until it was too late. What we do know is that two people who trusted him completely paid the ultimate price. Tina, who volunteered her time, who raised their daughter with love, who believed in their future together. Ariana, brilliant and talented, with her whole life ahead of her, who sang in the college choir, and dreamed of Italy and wanted to be a neuroscientist. They deserved better. They deserved the truth. They deserved the chance to survive this. If there's any small mercy, it's that investigators believe both Tina and Ariana were asleep when they were killed. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't suffer the terror of those final moments. Sandeep Bedi said that ignorance was bliss, that small comfort in an ocean of pain. The story of the Kamal family is a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that wealth doesn't insulate anyone from tragedy, that secrets left to fester can become toxic, and that when someone feels cornered, trapped by their own lies, they may make choices that seem unfathomable to the rest of us. It's also a reminder of the importance of reaching out. If you're struggling, financially or otherwise, tell someone. The shame of honesty is temporary. The consequences of deception can be permanent. There are resources available. Bankruptcy exists for a reason. Counselors, therapists, financial advisors, all are there to help people navigate hard times. And if you suspect someone you love is in trouble, or if you feel unsafe in your own home, speak up. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. These resources exist because situations like this happen, because people get desperate, because silence can be deadly. The mansion at 8 Wilson's Way in Dover, Massachusetts still stands. It's been foreclosed on, tangled up in legal proceedings, a monument to a family's tragedy. The Christmas lights that once decorated it are long gone. The laughter that might have echoed through its 27 rooms has been silenced forever. Tina Kamal was 54 years old. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend, a volunteer, a professional. She had so much left to give to the world. Ariana Kamal was 18. She was funny and quirky, brilliant and kind, a poet and a singer. She wanted to change the world. She never got the chance. Rakesh Kamal was 57. He was a software developer, an entrepreneur, a brother, a son, a husband, a father. He was also a man who made terrible choices. who let pride and fear guide him to an unthinkable act. We can acknowledge his humanity, while also condemning what he did. This is their story, a story of secrets and lies, of appearances and reality, of a family that looked perfect until the moment it shattered. Remember them. Remember that behind every closed door, there might be struggles we cannot see. Remember to reach out, to be honest, to ask for help when you need it. And now, as you drift toward sleep, let this story settle. Let it remind you of the fragility of life, the importance of truth, and the value of every single day we're given. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet suburbs of Texas, a story of friendship, betrayal, and a moment that changed everything. So let your mind drift as we journey back to 1980, to a small town called Wiley, where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen, until it did. This is a story about two women who seemed to have everything, and about how quickly a life can shatter on a Friday the 13th. In 1977, the landscape north of Dallas, Texas, was transforming. What had once been cattle ranches and cotton fields was becoming something new, something they would come to call Silicon Prairie. Technology companies were moving in, building gleaming campuses surrounded by endless parking lots. And with these companies came families, young professionals with growing children, seeking that perfect suburban dream. Among these families were the Montgomerys, Pat and Candace. Pat was an electrical engineer at Texas Instruments, working on complex military radar systems. His wife, Candy as everyone called her, had been a secretary when they met. Now she was a homemaker, tending to their two children in a comfortable house with a well-kept lawn. By all accounts, Candy was vivacious, the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. She had boundless energy, organizing church activities, leading Bible study classes, always moving, always doing. The Montgomerys found their social center at the First United Methodist Church of Lucas. It was here that they made friends, played volleyball on Thursday evenings, sang in the choir, and built the kind of community that gave their lives meaning in this newly settled prairie. And it was here that Candy met Betty Gore. Betty was different from Candy in almost every way. Where Candy was outgoing and effervescent, Betty was quiet and reserved. She'd grown up in Norwich, Kansas, a small town girl with traditional values. She'd married Alan Gore in January of 1970, and by all accounts it had been something of a surprise. Alan was small, plain, shy, a man with a receding hairline who didn't turn heads. But Betty had seen something in him, something steady and safe. Alan worked for Rockwell International as an optometrist. Betty taught 5th grade, though the work exhausted her. Her students were difficult to control, and Alan's frequent business trips left her feeling isolated in their home on Dogwood Street. Still, they had a daughter, Elisa, born in 1973, and they were building what they hoped would be a stable, predictable life. The two families, the Montgomerys and the Gores, became close friends through the church. Their daughters were the same age and became inseparable. The families would gather for potlucks, for volleyball games, for choir practice. They seemed to fit together perfectly, two normal families in a normal town, living normal lives. But beneath the surface, things were not quite so perfect. By the fall of 1978, Candy Montgomery had been married for nearly a decade. She had a good husband, healthy children, a nice home. She should have been content, but she wasn't. She felt restless, trapped in a routine that never varied. Wake up, make breakfast, take the children to school, run errands, clean the house, make dinner, go to bed, over and over, day after day. She wanted something more. Not to leave her marriage. No, she loved Pat in her own way. But she wanted excitement, a secret, something that was hers alone. And so, on an October evening at church volleyball, when she and Alan Gore collided reaching for the same ball, Candy noticed something. Alan smelled good, masculine, appealing. The thought came to her suddenly, unbidden, and once it arrived it wouldn't leave. A week later, she approached him after another volleyball game. They made small talk about their children, about the church, and then, with characteristic directness, Candy asked him a question that would change everything. "Would you be interested in having an affair?" Alan was shocked. He stammered that he couldn't do that to Betty. But Candy could see the curiosity in his eyes. She told him to think about it. No pressure. Just think about it. For weeks they talked. They had multiple conversations about what such an arrangement would look like. They would meet only on weekdays while their spouses worked. It would be purely physical, no falling in love, no emotional entanglement. If either of them started to develop feelings, they would end it immediately. They would split all expenses equally. No one could ever know. They were methodical about it, planning it like a business arrangement. Alan would use his 2-hour lunch break from his optometry practice. Candy would arrange things on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the days when her son attended Playday preschool at the church. She would pack lunches for them, book motel rooms, handle the logistics. They picked a date for their first meeting, December 12th, 1970, and so it began. For months they met at the Como Motel in Richardson, Texas, every 2 weeks like clockwork. At first it was exactly what they'd planned. Just physical release, a break from the monotony of their everyday lives. Alan had never been with anyone besides Betty. For him, this was intoxicating. But predictably, feelings began to develop. They found they could talk to each other in ways they couldn't talk to their spouses. They laughed together. They confided in each other. In February of 1979, just 2 months into the affair, Candy told Alan she was worried she was getting in too deep, but they didn't stop. Meanwhile, at home on Dogwood Street, Betty Gore was struggling. She found teaching exhausting, her students unruly and draining. Her marriage felt mechanical and empty. Alan was often distant, lost in his own thoughts. Their sex life had become almost non-existent, except for the clinical encounters during Betty's carefully calculated fertility windows when she wanted to conceive their second child. In the fall of 1978, Betty had decided it was time for another baby. She wanted the pregnancy planned precisely so the birth would occur in midsummer, allowing her to avoid taking time off from teaching. And so, during her fertile periods, she required Alan to perform what felt to him like mechanical, dutiful sex. No passion, no connection, just biological necessity. Alan resented it. He felt used, and it made the bright, exciting presence of Candy Montgomery all the more appealing. The affair continued through the spring of 1979. Betty became pregnant as planned, and in July she gave birth to a baby girl named Bethany. The delivery was difficult. Afterward, Betty sank into severe postpartum depression. She could barely function, could barely care for her newborn. Alan found himself stretched thin, trying to work, care for Elisa, and support his struggling wife. And then that same month, Alan and Betty attended something called Marriage Encounter, a church-sponsored retreat designed to help couples strengthen their relationships. It was intense, emotional, designed to break through barriers and help partners reconnect. For Alan, it worked. He felt guilty about his affair with Candy. He looked at his wife, exhausted, depressed, trying so hard to hold everything together, and he felt ashamed. In October of 1979, he made the decision. He couldn't continue seeing Candy. He didn't quite have the courage to tell her directly, But Candy could sense it. She could feel him pulling away, see the hesitation in his eyes. Finally she told him, "Alan, you seem to be leaving it up to me, so I've decided, I won't call, I won't try to see you." And just like that, the affair ended. Candy threw herself back into her marriage. She and Pat attended their own marriage encounter weekend. They worked on their relationship, tried to rekindle their connection. On the surface, things seemed to return to normal. The Montgomerys and the Gores still saw each other at church, still exchanged pleasantries, their daughters still played together. Life went on, but the affair had left its mark. There was a tension now, unspoken but present. Betty, for her part, had begun to suspect something. She didn't know the details, but she sensed that Alan had become distant, that something had shifted between them. She noticed the way he and Candy avoided eye contact at church, the way conversations became stilted when all four of them were together. She didn't say anything, but she wondered. And then came Friday, June 13th, 1980. Friday the 13th of June 1980 dawned hot in Wiley, Texas. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. Alan Gore had a business trip scheduled. He would fly to Minnesota for meetings with clients. It was routine, the kind of thing he did regularly for work. Before he left that morning, Betty asked him when he'd be back. He told her he'd return the following day. She nodded, already tired though the day had barely begun. Baby Bethany, not yet a year old, demanded constant attention, and Betty was still struggling with the lingering effects of her postpartum depression. Candy Montgomery, meanwhile, had made plans with her daughter and the Gore's older daughter, Elisa. The girls wanted to go swimming that day. Betty had agreed to let Elisa spend the day and night with the Montgomerys, giving her a break to focus on the baby. That morning, Candy called Betty to confirm the arrangements. She asked if she could stop by to pick up Elisa's swimsuit. Betty said yes, that would be fine. Come by around noon or so. Alan left for the airport. Betty was alone in the house with baby Bethany. She went about her morning routine, feeding the baby, changing diapers, trying to clean up a bit. The house was quiet, except for the sounds of the infant. Around 11:30 in the morning, Candy Montgomery drove to the Gore house on Dogwood Street. She was wearing casual clothes, nothing special. She knocked on the door, and Betty let her in. What happened next would be pieced together only through Candy's own testimony, and much of that would come only after hours of hypnosis with a psychiatrist. There were no other witnesses, just two women, alone in a house, about to have a conversation that would end in horror. Betty invited Candy into the utility room, where she kept the children's swimming things. They made small talk at first. The weather, the girls' play date, nothing unusual. But then, according to Candy's later account, Betty's tone changed. "Candy," she said, her voice quiet but tense, "are you having an affair with Alan?" The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, Candy later said she considered lying, but something in Betty's eyes told her that Betty already knew, or suspected strongly enough that a lie would only make things worse. "Yes," Candy admitted, "but it was a long time ago. It's over now." Betty's face didn't change much. She nodded slowly, processing this confirmation of what she'd suspected. Then, without a word, she left the utility room. Candy heard her footsteps moving through the house, heard a door open. When Betty returned, she was carrying something. A 3-foot wood-splitting axe. "Don't ever see my husband again," Betty said, her voice low and trembling. Candy raised her hands. "I won't," she said quickly. "Betty, I promise, I won't. It's been over for months. I'm so sorry." But Betty wasn't listening anymore. Or perhaps she was beyond listening. According to Candy's testimony, Betty's face had taken on a strange, distant quality. She swung the axe. What happened next would be described by one detective as looking like a scene from a horror movie. by another as the most vicious set of blows he'd ever seen in his career, by a psychiatrist as a dissociative reaction, triggered by childhood trauma. 41 times the axe came down, 41 times. When it was over, Betty Gore lay on the floor of her utility room in a spreading pool of blood. Her face was unrecognizable. The axe wounds covered her head, her neck, her arms where she'd tried to defend herself, her torso, even her legs. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, pooled thick and congealing in the Texas heat. And Candy Montgomery stood there, spattered in blood, the axe in her hands, staring down at what she'd done. Upstairs in her crib, baby Bethany began to cry. "What do you do when you've just killed your friend?" Candy Montgomery, standing in Betty Gore's utility room, had to make a decision, and she made it quickly. She dropped the axe. She went to the bathroom, stripped off her blood-soaked clothes, and took a shower. She scrubbed the blood from her skin, washed her hair, tried to remove every trace of what had just happened. Then she wrapped her bloody clothes in a towel, got dressed in clean clothes from her own home, and walked out of the house. Upstairs, baby Bethany was still crying in her crib. Candy didn't check on her, didn't call for help, didn't dial 911. She simply left. She drove home, disposed of her bloody clothes and shoes, and changed into fresh clothes. Then she picked up her children and drove to the church, where she taught a children's Bible class that afternoon. She acted completely normal, cheerful even. She taught the lesson, supervised the children, chatted with other parents. That evening, she and her family went to see the movie The Empire Strikes Back at the local theater. They ate popcorn. The children were excited. It was a perfectly normal Friday night. Meanwhile, back at 410 Dogwood Street, no one came or went. The phone rang periodically, Alan trying to reach Betty from Minnesota, but no one answered. The only sound from inside the house was the muffled crying of a baby who hadn't been fed or changed in hours. Around noon, a delivery man came to the door. He rang the bell multiple times. No answer. He left. Behind the house, the Gore family's 2 Cocker Spaniels paced anxiously in the yard, whimpering and howling. They knew something was wrong. At 4 o'clock, Alan called again from the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. He was about to board his plane to Minnesota. The phone rang 10-11 times. No answer. He started to feel uneasy. Betty should be home. Where could she be? In Minnesota. Throughout the evening, Alan tried calling again and again. Still no answer. His unease grew into genuine worry. Finally, around 9 o'clock, he called the Montgomery. Candy answered the phone. Alan asked if she knew where Betty was. Candy, her voice calm and concerned, said she'd stopped by earlier to pick up Elisa's swimsuit, and everything had seemed fine. Betty had seemed fine. Maybe she was visiting neighbors. Alan thanked her and hung up. Then he called neighbors, Lester Gaylor and his wife, who lived nearby. Could they check on Betty? He couldn't reach her, and he was starting to worry. The Gaylors walked over to the Gore house. It was almost 10 o'clock now, dark outside. The front door was locked. They knocked. No answer. But they could hear something, a baby crying hard, the kind of desperate wail that means a child has been crying for a long time. They found a way into the house, and then they found Betty. The scene in the utility room was beyond anything they could have imagined. Blood everywhere, Betty's body on the floor, mutilated beyond recognition, the axe lying nearby. They called the police immediately, and then they called Alan in Minnesota. When Alan's phone rang at his hotel at 11:30 that night, he knew something terrible had happened, but nothing could have prepared him for what the police told him. Betty was dead, murdered, in their home. Baby Bethany had been alone with the body for over 12 hours. His first thought, he would later testify, was a burglary gone wrong. A random intruder. It had to be. Who would want to hurt Betty? The police had the same question. When the Collin County Sheriff's Department arrived at 410 Dogwood Street, they were confronted with a crime scene unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Detective Steve DeFebo, who led the investigation, would later say it looked like something from a horror movie. Blood covered the utility room floor, thick and congealed. It was splattered on the walls, the ceiling. Betty Gore's body was in the center of it all, so badly mutilated that identifying her facial features was nearly impossible. The coroner would eventually count 41 separate axe wounds, 28 to the head and neck alone. The brutality of it stunned the investigators. This wasn't a simple killing. This was rage, fury, overkill of the most extreme kind. And it had happened on Friday the 13th, just weeks after the release of Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, in which Jack Nicholson's character goes mad and chases his family with an axe. The parallels were unsettling. Was this a copycat killing? But as they investigated, that theory fell apart. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of forced entry. And there at the crime scene was a bloody fingerprint. Who had Betty Gore known well enough to let into her house on a Friday morning? The investigation began to focus on Betty's life, her friends, her acquaintances, her routine, and one name kept coming up: Candy Montgomery. Candy had been the last person to see Betty alive, or so she claimed when police first interviewed her. She'd stopped by to pick up a swimsuit, she said. They'd chatted briefly. Everything had seemed normal. She'd left, and Betty had been alive and well. But then Alan Gore, in his grief and confusion, mentioned something to investigators. About 7 or 8 months earlier, he'd had an affair with Candy Montgomery. Suddenly the police had a motive. They questioned Candy again. This time, they were more pointed. Had she been having an affair with Alan Gore? Candy admitted it. Yes, she had. But it had ended months ago, October of 1979. They'd both moved on. She and Pat had worked on their marriage. Everything was fine now. The police weren't so sure. They examined the bloody fingerprint found at the scene. They looked at hair samples recovered from the Gore's shower, suggesting the killer had cleaned up before leaving. They found a footprint that appeared to be from a woman's shoe. On June 27th, 2 weeks after the murder, they arrested Candy Montgomery and charged her with murder. The community was shocked. Candy? Sweet, cheerful, church-going Candy Montgomery, who taught Sunday school and organized potlucks and sang in the choir. She'd killed Betty Gore with an axe. Some people refused to believe it. Others began to remember small details that seemed significant in retrospect. The way Candy had seemed completely normal on the day of the murder. The way she'd taught Bible school that very afternoon, just hours after leaving Betty's body on the floor. The way she'd gone to a movie that night with her family, eaten popcorn, acted as if nothing had happened. How could someone do that? How could someone kill their friend and then just continue with their day? Candy was released on bond, $100,000, and she hired a lawyer, Don Crowder, a man from their church who specialized in personal injury cases. He'd never handled a murder trial before, but Candy trusted him, and Don Crowder, despite his inexperience, was about to devise a defense strategy that would shock everyone. Don Crowder had a problem. His client had admitted to killing Betty Gore. The forensic evidence supported that. Her fingerprints were at the scene. She'd been the last person to see Betty alive, and she had a motive. The affair with Alan, the fear that Betty might expose her, might ruin her reputation in their close-knit church community. But Candy insisted she hadn't gone to the Gore house intending to hurt anyone. She'd just gone to pick up a swimsuit. Betty had confronted her about the affair. Betty had grabbed the axe, and Candy had defended herself. Self-defense. That would be the strategy, but there was a problem with that too. 41 axe blows. How do you explain 41 axe blows as self-defense? Crowder knew he needed something more. Something that would explain the sheer brutality of the killing while still maintaining Candy's innocence. He needed to get inside Candy's mind, understand what had happened in that utility room. And so he sent her to a psychiatrist named Dr. Fred Faison. Dr. Faison was based in Houston in the exclusive River Oaks neighborhood. He was a psychiatrist and clinical hypnotist with a reputation for working with defense attorneys on criminal cases. He'd testified in multiple trials, often arguing for insanity defenses or psychological explanations for violent behavior. Crowder hoped he could find something, some explanation, some trauma, some psychological key that would make sense of what Candy had done. Dr. Faison met with Candy multiple times. During their sessions, he used hypnosis to try to access her memories of June 13th. Hypnosis was controversial even then, its reliability questioned by many in the scientific community. But Dr. Faison believed in its power to unlock repressed memories and hidden traumas. The sessions were intense. A witness, who sat in the waiting room during one of them, later reported hearing screams coming from Dr. Faison's office. Loud, terrified shrieks that went on for several minutes. Under hypnosis, Dr. Faison had Candy revisit that day. He had her describe in detail what had happened in the utility room, and as she spoke, a narrative began to emerge. Betty had confronted her about the affair. Candy had admitted it but said it was over. Betty had left the room and returned with the axe. She'd told Candy never to see Alan again. Candy had agreed, had tried to apologize, but then, according to Candy's hypnotic testimony, Betty had swung the axe at her. They'd struggled. Betty had struck Candy's toe, cutting it, and in that moment, Candy said something inside her had snapped. But Dr. Faison wanted to go deeper. He asked Candy, under hypnosis, if she'd ever felt that kind of rage before, and Candy's face changed. She was transported back, not to June 13, 1980, but to a day in the mid-1950s, when she was about 4 or 6 years old. She'd been at a doctor's office, she said. She'd cut herself on broken glass, and her mother had taken her to get stitches. The experience had been terrifying. The blood, the pain, the fear. She'd started screaming, crying hysterically on the examination table. And her mother, embarrassed by the scene her daughter was making in front of the other patients, had leaned close and hissed one word at her. "Shh. What will people in the waiting room think?" her mother had said. "Shh." In that moment, Dr. Faison theorized, Candy had learned to suppress her rage, her fear, her pain. She'd learned to push it all down, hide it away, be the good girl, the quiet girl, the girl who didn't make a scene. For 26 years, that suppressed rage had stayed buried. And then in Betty Gore's utility room, Betty had said that same word to her, "Shh," and 26 years of hidden anger had exploded. This, Dr. Faison would later testify, was the key to understanding what had happened. Candy hadn't consciously decided to kill Betty. She'd experienced what he called a dissociative reaction, a psychological break triggered by childhood trauma. In that moment, she wasn't herself anymore. She was that terrified 4-year-old, being told to be quiet, to suppress her feelings, to make herself small, and this time, she hadn't. It was a controversial theory. Some would later call it junk science, point to studies showing that hypnosis doesn't reliably recover accurate memories. But in 1980, it was compelling enough for Don Crowder to build his defense around it. The trial of Candace Montgomery began in October of 1980, just 4 months after Betty Gore's murder. It was held in McKinney, Texas, the county seat. Judge Tom Ryan had ordered the old courthouse reopened for the occasion because it had the largest courtroom, with seating for 250 people. He knew the case would draw massive public interest. He was right. The courtroom was packed every day. People lined up outside hoping for a seat. The media covered every moment. This was the most sensational case Collin County had ever seen. On the first day of jury selection, Don Crowder did something that shocked everyone in the room. Standing before the potential jurors, he made a simple, straightforward statement. Candace Montgomery killed Betty Gore, he said slowly, deliberately. She did so with an axe. She did so in self-defense. The homicide was justified. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Crowder had just admitted his client's guilt, but he was also framing it in a very specific way, not as murder but as justified homicide. Self-defense. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Tom O'Connell, spent 5 days presenting their case. They brought in the coroner, Dr. Irving Stone, who testified about the 41 axe wounds, 28 to the head and neck alone. This was overkill, he said. This was rage, not defense. They called Alan Gore to the stand. He testified about his affair with Candy, which had lasted about 10 months. He described how it had ended, how he'd tried to focus on his marriage afterward. He talked about calling neighbors the night of June 13th, worried because Betty wasn't answering the phone. The prosecution argued that Candy had killed Betty to keep the affair secret, to protect her reputation in their conservative community. They argued that she could have fled, could have called for help, but instead had struck Betty 41 times. But when the defense's turn came, Don Crowder kept his promise. He put Candy Montgomery on the stand. She was dressed conservatively, matronly. Crowder had been explicit about what she should wear, how she should present herself. She spoke carefully, enunciating each word, keeping her emotions in check. She told her story. She'd gone to the Gore house to pick up a swimsuit. Betty had confronted her about the affair. She'd admitted it but said it was over. Betty had gotten the axe, had told her never to see Alan again. She'd agreed. She'd tried to apologize, had reached out to touch Betty's arm in sympathy, and Betty had shoved her into the utility room and swung the axe. They'd struggled. Betty had cut her toe, and then Candy's voice faltered. She couldn't explain what happened next. She didn't remember. It was like she'd been in a trance, watching herself from outside her body. When it was over, Betty was on the floor, dead, and Candy had been covered in blood. Then Dr. Fred Faison took the stand. He explained his hypnosis sessions with Candy. He described the childhood trauma, the suppressed rage, the trigger word. He testified that in his professional opinion, Candy had experienced a dissociative reaction. She hadn't been in control of her actions. The fury that drove those 41 blows had come from somewhere deep and primal, somewhere Candy herself couldn't access consciously. The prosecution tried to counter this. They brought their own psychiatrist, Dr. Clay Griffith, who disputed Dr. Faison's theory, but Dr. Griffith had to admit he hadn't actually examined Candy. His testimony was theoretical. The defense also called a polygraph examiner, Don McElroy, who testified that Candy had passed a lie detector test. She was telling the truth when she said she hadn't gone to the Gore house intending to harm Betty. She was telling the truth when she said she'd acted in self-defense. For 8 days the trial continued. The community remained divided. Some people believed Candy's story, others thought it was absurd. 41 axe blows couldn't possibly be self-defense, no matter what psychological explanation you offered. On October 29th, the lawyers gave their closing arguments. Tom O'Connell for the prosecution hammered on the brutality of the killing. 41 blows. That wasn't self-defense. That was murder. Don Crowder for the defense painted a picture of a woman who'd been attacked, who'd fought for her life, and who'd been overtaken by a psychological response beyond her control. This wasn't premeditated. This wasn't murder. This was a tragic accident born of trauma and terror. The jury, 9 women and 3 men, retired to deliberate. They were back in just over 3 hours. The verdict: not guilty. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and intense. As Candy Montgomery left the courthouse, escorted by security, a crowd gathered outside. They weren't there to congratulate her. "Murderer," they chanted. "Murderer, murderer." Candy, who had remained composed throughout the trial, finally broke down in tears. She hurried to her attorney's car and was driven away. Inside, one of the jurors, Alice Doherty, tried to explain their decision to reporters. The 41 axe blows, she said, hadn't swayed them. "We determined it never had a bearing on the verdict at all," she said, "whether it was one gunshot or 1,000 whacks. What mattered to them was whether Candy had acted in self-defense in that initial moment, and they'd been convinced that she had. But many in the community didn't see it that way. They felt justice had not been served." Betty Gore's father, Bob Pomeroy, said, "As far as I'm concerned, justice will be served. She has to live with it. I wouldn't say I was happy with the verdict. We don't know what happened, and we never will know what happened." The Montgomerys left Texas soon after the trial. They moved to Georgia, trying to start over, but the marriage couldn't withstand the strain. 4 years later, Candy and Pat divorced. Candy changed her name back to her maiden name, Wheeler. She became a mental health counselor, working with her daughter. She built a new life, far from Wiley, far from the church community that had once been her whole world. Alan Gore remarried quickly after Betty's death, but that marriage also ended in divorce. His 2 daughters, Elisa and Bethany, were raised by Betty's parents. Alan lost custody, lost his family, lost everything that had once defined his life. Don Crowder, the attorney who'd won Candy's acquittal, found the case haunted him. Years later, he would tell reporters that the faces of Betty Gore's family still appeared in his mind. He wondered if they understood that he'd just been doing his job, defending his client. The case, he said, had been either the zenith of an extraordinarily successful career, or the demise of what could have been. In 1998, Don Crowder died by suicide. The town of Wiley was changed by what happened. For months after the murder, stores closed early. People locked their doors, looked over their shoulders. The trust that had defined their close-knit community was shattered. How could you know who to trust when your church friend, your Bible study leader, your neighbor could be capable of such violence? And Betty Gore, she was buried in Kansas, returned to the small town she'd come from. Her daughters grew up without her. Her family was left with questions that would never be fully answered. What really happened in that utility room on June 13th? Did Betty really attack first, or had Candy, in a moment of panic or rage or calculated decision, picked up the axe herself? We'll never know. There were only 2 people in that room, and one of them is dead. The case of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery remains one of the most controversial trials in Texas history. It raises questions about justice, about truth, about the nature of memory and trauma. It asks us to consider what self-defense really means, and whether there can ever be justification for such extreme violence. Candy Montgomery was acquitted. In the eyes of the law, she was innocent. But in the eyes of many who knew Betty Gore, justice was never served. The story reminds us that even in the safest-seeming suburbs, even in the closest-knit communities, darkness can lurk beneath the surface. That the people we think we know, our friends, our neighbors, the people we sit beside in church, may be carrying secrets, pain, rage that we cannot see. And it reminds us that a single moment can change everything. A confrontation, a word, a choice. On a hot Friday in June 1980, 2 women walked into a utility room in a house on Dogwood Street. Only one of them walked out. The other was left behind, 41 wounds carved into her body. Her life ended in a way that seems almost impossible to comprehend. This is the story of Betty Gore, a teacher, a mother, a woman who, for reasons we'll never fully understand, died at the hands of her friend. May she rest in peace. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.